This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. Across the country, vulnerable students are struggling with the switch to remote learning in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic. Experts worry the loss of face-to-face instruction will turn the existing achievement gap for poor, Black, and Brown students into a gaping chasm. Complicating reporting on this issue is uncertainty about how the coronavirus spreads and the degree of risk to children and adults in reopening schools. Journalist Alec MacGillis of ProPublica goes deep into these issues in a news story co-published with The New Yorker. It's told in part through the experiences of a 12-year-old student in MacGillis's hometown of Baltimore. Alec, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks for having me, Emily.
Early in your career, you were an education reporter for the Baltimore Sun, but now your focus is politics and government. I'm curious why this was a story you wanted to tell.
Well, I used to cover education at the Baltimore Sun. I was a higher ed reporter for about 4 years. And then I did a big series on the digital divide, on sort of how education software companies were targeting poor schools, poor low-income students back around 2004. So I had some familiarity with the whole sort of digital divide question. And what I saw last spring after the school closures went into effect in March was just this really kind of alarming recapitulation of that divide, way starker than what I had seen years ago. Namely, that I saw students here in Baltimore, especially this one sixth grader that I was tutoring and mentoring, being caught completely adrift by the shift to remote learning here in Baltimore, not only because of technological problems, but because there was just no one around at home to assist him, to make sure that he was doing what little classwork was being expected of him. And I saw this happening, and I also saw that there was just what I thought was an appalling lack of attention being brought to this problem at the time in those early months of the pandemic, March, April, May, and just sort of saw how sort of everyone else, all of us sort of in the middle class, upper middle class America, were not really paying attention to this problem because we are so kind of turned inward on our own families, on our own kind of hunkering down in the pandemic. And so I got thinking about this problem and very worried about it. And I thought it would be moot come September. I thought that we would basically get ourselves back in school, but then that turned out to be not the case. So I decided to write about it.
What you describe in the story, though, for Shamar, it's a perfect storm, isn't it? He has a mother struggling with drug addiction, an unstable home life, limited opportunities for enrichment. He's surrounded by people who care about him, but they can't get him what he needs. And these are all things that arguably being in school would help him to get.
Exactly. Basically, his situation is very representative of so many kids here in Baltimore and elsewhere. So his mother is, as you mentioned, has long suffered from serious drug addiction, as many, many people here in town do. He bounces all around between homes. In the span of the early months of the pandemic, from March to July, he lived in 3 different homes. Most of the time, he's been at his grandmother's house, where there's actually quite a lot of other people living. There are 8 people jammed into this small row house. None of them are really in a position to be keeping an eye on him and keeping on top of his schoolwork. His grandmother is, as she explained to me, had got little education growing up in South Carolina and is actually kind of going blind, losing her eyesight. So she has trouble even seeing the computer screen. His great uncle who lives there is actually illiterate. His older siblings, who are in their 20s, who are in the house, all have jobs in college. And one of them actually has a little kid of her own. And then his mother is not around very much to help out. So he's surrounded by people often, but he's basically on his own. And school was the one place where he got to be with kids his own age and where teachers really had a shot of reaching him.
What was painful for me in reading your story is frankly how beautifully it transmits the idea that the kids are walking, breathing potential, and how often we, the adults of the world, are falling short of supporting that.
Definitely. He's a really bright kid. I noticed right away when I started working with him a couple years ago that he has a real natural knack for math. He's just really good at doing just basic computational stuff. much better than a lot of the other kids I've worked with in recent years. His reading is definitely lagging, but one of the things that's kind of nice about working with him is that when you are reading with him, he always stops to ask anytime he comes across a word that he doesn't recognize. He'll ask you what it is instead of just kind of pretending that he knows. He's got an incredibly sharp wit. He's got an amazing sense of direction. He makes his way all around town on various buses and light rail. Wherever he's living at the time, he knows how to get where he needs to go. When we're driving around town, it's funny, if I take a shortcut or if I decide to take a different way one day between stops, he'll just sort of suddenly challenge me and say, why are we going this way? This isn't the way we usually go. He's a really fun kid to be with. He has extraordinary potential, but it's also very, very easy to see how a kid like him could just be lost during a time like this and maybe beyond.
You clearly know him well and you clearly care about him. Was it a difficult decision to make him part of this story?
It was. It's something I gave a lot of thought to. And what I eventually decided was that there was just a power to telling the story through his story that would have been hard to achieve had I gone out and found some other child or children here in town to tell it through. Mainly because with him, I was able to tell you sort of what he was like before. I actually knew viscerally what he was like before the pandemic and how the pandemic had affected him. And so I could tell you the story from the start. Whereas with another child, I would have certainly done my best to recreate that and try to get a sense of that, but it wouldn't have been as visceral. And I also decided in the end that it was, in a way, also the most honest way to tell a story, because it really was his situation that had prompted me to want to do the piece in the first place, that had kind of awoken me to this. So in a way, it was the most organic way to tell it. And I, of course, in my deliberations about whether to make him part of the story, discussed it with the whole family, and they understood what the thinking was and gave me their permission.
This is a story about how Shamar is struggling, but it's also a story about the teachers and educators in Baltimore who are struggling with their own kinds of burdens when it comes to figuring out how to deliver education. I'm thinking about the students, but also how to keep students safe. And I'm thinking about people like Superintendent Sonia Santelises. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, I absolutely wanted to speak with educators as well. And I did speak with Dr. Santelises, the superintendent, and I spoke with the head of the Baltimore Teachers Union, DeMonte Brown, and I spoke with several teachers, including one that I feature especially, who was a remarkable woman by the name of Karen Negoso, who was Shamar's fourth grade math teacher. And I got to know her when he was in fifth grade, and she was still keeping an eye on him, even though she wasn't his teacher anymore. And I actually met her one night when Shamar's mom thought that he'd gone missing, hadn't been able to find him all afternoon, and reached out to me, and we went looking for him all around town. And finally ended up calling the police, and we went back to the shelter where they were living at the time to meet the police. And there were two of Shamar's teachers had come out to help look for him. This is at 7 o'clock at night on a weekday evening. And I was just really struck that these two women had come out to help out way beyond the call of duty. And one of them was Karen Negoso, who hadn't even had him as a student for a year. So I was just really kind of struck by her commitment. We've stayed in touch since then. And so I reached out to her to see what she made of this whole decision about whether to go back to school. And we had a really long interview walking through the park one day in the summer. And I was struck because if I had had to guess, I might have guessed that Karen would have been one of the teachers here in Baltimore who was in favor of going back to in-person instruction, because she's all about sort of rigor and high expectations and kind of doing things right, and almost kind of a cultural conservative within the Baltimore context. But in fact, she was opposed to going back, and she was opposed because she had such little trust for her fellow residents of Baltimore. She sees constantly the families of her students, parents of her students, not doing enough to support her students at home, not stepping up, not taking responsibility the way that she would like them to do. And she feared that lack of responsibility, that lack of accountability on the home front, was going to mean that a lot of her students would be exposed at home and might be bringing the virus into her classroom.
I think one of the luxuries you have writing for ProPublica and the New Yorker is you get space and you get time, but it's obviously not unlimited. There was plenty that you could have focused on staying in the current moment here, but in this piece, you took us back to the origins of universal education in the United States. Why was that a priority for you?
That was something I really wanted to do because it was really how I conceived of the piece in the first place. When I first started seeing the closures in the spring and seeing how it was going to affect kids in schools, and then seeing as the summer went on that we were headed toward a situation where in many cities we were going to have public schools students not actually going to school and private school students who were going to school, or public school students who were going to be pulled out of the schools and into pods or into homeschooling situations. It really struck me that what we are at risk of allowing right now in this moment was essentially an end to universal education in America. That this amazing thing that the country had achieved or had aspired to way back in the early mid 19th century, way before most of the rest of the Western world, we are aspiring toward universal public education, with the major exception of enslaved children in the South who were denied any education. This country was a pioneer in this regard. And to see now that the country that had pioneered universal education was now really putting that at risk and really looking like it might be heading into a moment where we were no longer going to have true universal education, where we're going to have some kids, a lot of kids, particularly poor Black and brown kids at home, maybe on a computer, maybe not. And then other kids, wealthier, whiter kids, actually going to school in wealthy suburban districts or in private schools. That's pretty incredible. And I thought the best way to get that across was to give some of that historical context.
Well, we know about some of the long-term consequences of having students' educations disrupted to this severe a degree. And I want to encourage people to read your full story because you mention a few historical benchmarks, including Germany and England as the countries who recovered from the wreckage of World War II. You also mentioned New Orleans post-Hurricane Katrina. And I think that last one is the one that most education reporters would be thinking of most immediately, not necessarily going back, but we're in whole new territory here, aren't we?
We are. So that was the other history that I wanted to bring to the piece. I brought in first the early 19th century universal education movement, and then I wanted to bring in these episodes of hiatus in kids' schooling and the long-term consequences of those moments of hiatus, just to drive home what the stakes were here. Because we've seen this happen before in various places and times, and there is a huge cost to it. The European research from World War II was really striking. I didn't even know that this research was out there, but what they did, I couldn't get into this in the piece, but what they did was the researchers compared the outcomes for kids who were 10 years old in 1940 in Germany and Austria as they grew up in the 50s and 60s with the outcomes of the same aged kids growing up in Switzerland and Sweden, which were, of course, neutral countries in the war. And the outcomes in all sorts of different ways for the German and Austrian kids were much worse. And then there's the research on Katrina. And then what I focus on most in the piece is what happened in Prince Edward County, Virginia, when the schools were shut down for 4 years, starting in 1959, to avoid having to integrate them. And you had hundreds of Black children in that county going without any formal schooling for several years. And it just had really deleterious lifelong consequences. And I really thought it was important to remind people of that.
We're talking with ProPublica's Alec MacGillis about the perils of remote learning for vulnerable students in the COVID-19 era. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And if you're interested in hearing more about what happened in Prince Edward County, I'd like to recommend that you look for Kristen Green's book. It's widely available. Alec, one of the central arguments of your piece is that school closures nationally were influenced as much by politics as by reliance on existing studies and science about the risk. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. You simply can't overstate how much politics has played into this. The clearest example of this, of course, is something I mentioned in the piece, the moment where Donald Trump and Betsy DeVos came out in July and made a big push one day demanding that schools reopen around the country, doing so in very kind of blunt fashion, typically kind of Trumpian blunt fashion. without any real promise of major resources to go along with it to help schools do what they needed to do to open safely. And the effect that that had, the sort of negative polarization that that had on teachers and parents who might have been open to going back to school, but then in our highly polarized moment, saw it as a Trump thing and kind of moved to the other corner. But I actually think the political dynamic goes beyond that and would probably have existed even if Trump hadn't come out like that on schools. It's simply a fact, if you look at all sorts of surveys, that throughout this pandemic, the assessment of risk of catching the coronavirus has been way higher among Democrats and in blue cities and towns. And so it's not surprising that we've ended up with this situation where you have schools in blue areas remaining closed, even though their case numbers are now quite good. Maryland, for instance, today announced that it had 0 deaths yesterday for the first time in 6 months. The numbers have gotten very good in Maryland. Nonetheless, all districts are closed in Maryland. And then meanwhile, you have schools opening up in red states despite the numbers not being as good there. And it has a lot to do with those contrasting assessments of risk. And I do believe that one reason that, and I touch on this in the piece, and it's definitely kind of a touchy point, but I believe that one reason that the assessment of risk is so much higher in a lot of blue areas is that for a lot of Democrats, COVID has become to some degree a metaphor for Donald Trump. And because his failures on COVID have been so huge, it's been hard to sort of disentangle our assessments of Donald Trump's performance from our assessment of the risk of COVID. And so I do believe that is one reason why you end up with a situation where in a lot of Democratic cities and towns, you still have extraordinary measures being taken against COVID, including, for instance, a lot of playgrounds still being wrapped in police tape and off limits. And so it's not so surprising that a lot of parents would react to this push to open schools and say, wait a second, what are you talking about? How can my child possibly be safe in school when they're still not even allowed to go in the playground, when the playground's considered dangerous? And so I really do think that so much of this comes down to these completely different notions of COVID risk that have developed in the two different parts of America.
And it's also a question of trust, isn't it? Which is what you were talking about with Shamar's teacher not having confidence in her neighbors in Baltimore to protect the environment. And teachers need to feel safe going back to work, and parents need to feel safe sending their children.
Yes, I mean, trust plays into this too. The trust is somewhat less of a partisan issue, and it's much more of a localized and racial issue. In cities like Baltimore, you have a lot of Black families that feel they have very little reason to trust local officials, the school system. They feel like they've been let down so many times. And so that's much more of a matter of a lack of institutional trust rather than necessarily something connected to Trump per se. And the local school system is very aware of that problem. And it's something they've actually been struggling with in recent years. One telling anecdote that I didn't get to include in the piece is that the school system here for several years now has been working with Johns Hopkins to help get kids eyeglasses, kids who need eyeglasses. And the school system made the deliberate decision to use the opt-in approach, to basically leave it up to parents to say, yes, I want my kid to get eyeglasses, rather than using the opt-out approach where the school system would basically get every kid who needed eyeglasses unless the parents said, no thanks. They just decided that even though it would be less effective in a way to use the opt-in approach, that they thought it was better to use that to build up parent trust. And so they've been very conscious of this trust issue for several years now. And now they've just seen how it's sort of become an issue here where you have a lot of parents, not all parents, but a lot of parents expressing reluctance to send their kids back to school because they simply didn't trust the school system to do it right.
There's been some pushback to your reporting on social media, predominantly around how you frame some of your arguments about the political effect on people questioning the relative safety of bringing kids back. Is there anything you'd like to revisit or rethink in your piece?
No, if anything, I just wish I'd had even more space to lay out even more of the evidence and the arguments on this front. There's just growing evidence to support the fact that it's safe to bring kids back to school if you do it right and if you do it in places that have decent community transmission numbers. I mean, the fact is, we're now many weeks into the school season in parts of the country that opened back in mid-August. across the Deep South. School, of course, opens pretty early there. And so far, even though these states, a lot of these communities don't have the best community transmission rates, even though they're not the best resourced or doing everything just the way a public health expert might recommend, we are so far not seeing something really alarming rise in community transmission like you saw, say, in Israel back in the late spring when they opened their schools kind of rashly there. We're not seeing that. And we're also seeing really good numbers coming out of Europe, even though a lot of the places that are opening have opened schools in Europe, including France, have community transmission numbers worse than ours. And so there's an odd abstraction to this debate often these days where we're talking about what might happen if we open up schools in all these cities while and overlooking the fact that they are in fact open in many parts of our own country. And we're sort of acting like that's not happening. There's not been a whole lot of reporting from the places that have actually done this and on the whole seem to be managing.
What's the role of education reporters here? I mean, we're talking about fractured times, a lack of trust, and debates over which studies are valid. And there just seems to be a lot of evidence that's coming hard and fast every day.
There is a lot of evidence coming hard and fast every day. And I think that what I would just urge reporters in general, both education reporters and science reporters to do is to always be thinking about the preponderance of the data, right? To not seize on just one study or another study just because it seems to have a very kind of stark finding. That's exactly what happened with great detriment in the study that I mentioned in the piece, this study that came out in July purporting to show that according to all this South Korean contact tracing, that 10 to 19-year-olds were way more likely to transmit even than a lot of adults, which immediately when that study came out, it got huge headlines. It caused all sorts of alarm and had played a big role in the decision-making of a lot of districts, despite the fact that a lot of public health experts were immediately calling it into question and warning about its credibility. And then lo and behold, a couple of weeks later, it came out that it was flawed in all sorts of ways. And the New York Times had to write a correction piece about it. And so we should always be looking to preponderance, like what is the accumulation of studies and data showing us? Beyond that, I mean, I think what I would love, there are specific stories that I would love to see daily, education beat reporters looking at. I would love to see more stories about how things are actually going in the places that have in-person instruction. There was a great story in the Washington Post recently out of one district in Mississippi, I believe it was, on sort of how things are going for one fourth grade teacher who has both in-person and remote students to attend to. I would love to know what's going on in Connecticut. Connecticut has been sort of an outlier in that it's a very blue state that has been very aggressive about opening schools back up. The governor there pushed hard for that. I'm really curious to hear how it's going in Connecticut. I'm really curious to know what's going on in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is, of course, an interesting case because the teachers' unions there were eviscerated by Scott Walker. And so you've had more school openings in Wisconsin than you might have had if the unions were still more present there. I'm curious to hear how that's going. Just in general, as much reporting as we can get from around the country, especially from these places that have in fact opened up.
Alec, I don't want to let you go without a chance at this question. It's something I'm curious about. As we mentioned, you were an education reporter. Is there anything that you learned on that beat that you think you've carried forward with you to these other responsibilities in these areas that you cover?
I would say that one thing I learned, especially when I was doing that big series on education software companies targeting poor schools, which by the way led to a investigation that I did, an eventual FBI investigation and federal prison term for the superintendent of the Prince George's County Schools in Maryland, is to always be skeptical. And this applies, of course, to cross journalism, but to always be skeptical of conventional wisdom and truths and received assumptions about schooling. And in that case, what I discovered was that I came to question the notion of the digital divide as it was commonly understood at the time. What I found was that the digital divide wasn't so much that poor kids didn't have computers or weren't using computers in their schools, but rather that they were using them far more than students in wealthier districts, wealthier schools. And they were using them for this really pretty terrible drill and kill type software type of education because these companies have been targeting these schools so much to spend their Title I money on these kind of programs. So in fact, the common notion of the digital divide was somewhat backward in a way that carries through to what we're now seeing right now, where you have poor, disadvantaged students who are right now much more likely to be spending their days staring at a screen at home while students in wealthier public schools and private schools are far more likely right now to be getting in-person instruction from a teacher. And so I would just constantly just encourage people to be always using your own judgment on something, always taking a fresh look, and just trying to be as independent-minded as possible.
Alec MacGillis is a reporter for ProPublica, and he joined us from Baltimore. Alec, thank you very much for making time for EWA Radio.
Thanks, Emily.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line at radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.